Model Context Protocol has pretty much been on top of everyone's mind inside the AI community over the past month or so. Even Sam Altman and Sundar Pichai came onto Twitter to say that they will be integrating MCP into their core product. Given that this was originally an Anthropic-led standard, the fact that their competitors are integrating the standard really shows you how much traction it has got in the community. But having dived very deeply into the protocol spec, I can tell you most implementations are only scratching the surface of what the protocol is truly capable of. So today, I'm going to walk you through where we are currently and where developers could be implementing in the upcoming month. We've got a very exciting journey ahead of us. So let's just dive straight in. First thing you really have to bear in mind is that there's two parts to this protocol, right? There's the client and also the server. What most people fail to notice is that no matter how powerful the server is, if you have a terrible client, the users are not going to have a great experience because the client is responsible for making all of the MCP server calls. So how the client designs its own agentic loop, how it feeds in the configuration to the LLMs so that it knows to make the right calls to the different MCP servers out there, that's absolutely crucial there, which is why you can see that even though so many people provide you with capabilities that you can shove in MCPs, but your mileage can vary quite a lot between different clients. There's actually 5 core capabilities of the MCP protocol, notably prompts, resources, tools, sampling, and routes. I don't think I even need to explain tools to most people because this is by far the ones that you will have to encounter the most. For example, the Slack MCP server, it provides tools to allow the MCP client to, say, list channels, query for specific messages that were sent, and even send messages directly through the MCP server, querying users, doing all sorts of Slack API related things, right? And you can have the Postgres MCP that allows it to run raw database queries, query tables, and get metadata, get schema content, etc. I've heard many people say that, oh, just a glorified REST API. Actually, if the MCP is just implementing the tools, I'd say yes, they are correct. But there's 4 other components that we haven't touched on yet. This is not something that can be easily achieved, at least not with good structure if you use a raw REST API. And then we move on to resources. So these are abstract definitions of, well, resources that are shared between the client and server. So this could be things that the client provides the server for processing, or it could be the resources that the server can provide. Example could be on the client side, it could provide local files with, the files // references for content they can reference and send to the server. Say the Postgres one can return the Postgres // URLs, the URIs to send it back to say, oh, this is specific object within this database, or rather this table within this database that the client can directly refer to. So it gives the protocol an easy way to specify definitions. The place where we've seen this used the most is mostly just sharing raw context here. So not the most interesting part of the protocol, but a noteworthy one. And then we move on to prompts. This is where things start to get a bit more interesting, because with prompts, servers can actually provide fully fledged prompt templates directly to the client and even allow parameters to be set. I'll show you in a quick demo in a second. And so if the server provides some advanced capabilities that requires a bit more convoluted prompts to leverage, as we've seen with most servers, they don't necessarily have the LLM capabilities directly built in. But if the server can provide the prompt template, as well as the tools to retrieve those resources, then the client can use the LLM to synthesize the final results. This makes the server implementer's job a lot easier so that they can focus on just the utility of the server rather than the agentic loop or the LLM implementation itself. If we go back into the GPT 3.5 world where, people were making millions selling prompt templates, we can do that again, right? And so here you can literally have a server that hosts all of your prompt templates and then that provides this directly to all of your MCP clients. So this is where the protocol shines, because if you have a single server that provides this prompt templates, you can integrate this into all of the clients that you currently use and leverage that capability without having to do, well, custom plugins and or prompt copy and pasting every single time you use a client. It would work in Cursor, it would work in Windsurf, it would work in Claude Desktop, or any client that implements this prompt capability. When we go to client, this is where things get really interesting. And I know most people would say, wait, why does a client have to implement any capabilities here? And don't they just make calls to the server? But actually, the protocol specifies two things that the client can provide that can make this whole process even more effective. One is sampling, and the other one is routes. With sampling, it's a capability that allows MCP servers to request for LLM generation from the client. The protocol doesn't make any assumptions whether the server has any LLM capabilities, but assumes the client has, right? Because, well, that's where all of the synthesizing happen. Sampling allows the MCP server to send notifications to the client to request for samples and LLM generations based on specific content, so that all of your LLM interactions can actually go via the MCP client or via a human in the loop design, so that you can control what goes into the LLM, what LLM you actually end up using, and adjusting and routing all of the calls purely on the client side. Obviously, there's an alternative way that you can implement this on the server, where you can just hide away the fact that your server is actually using any LLM at all. But the beauty of doing sampling on the client side is that as part of this client sampling call, it could also attach its own context, maybe about other servers it has and other contexts and resources it has, such that it can do the generation with all of the client's context, which the server would not have. The server would only have what the client has sent it. But because the client actually is able to do this generation, it can decide what are the contexts it wants to pass in and what it wants to return to the other server. And even in the protocol itself, Anthropic specifies the fact that you can request for context from other MCP servers to also be injected. So via sampling, we can have interesting collaborations between different MCP servers utilizing each other's context, but without actually breaking any privacy concerns, because MCP client is always in control of what gets passed around. And then the final one is routes. I say routes is more like a subset of resources. It's there to define boundaries for resources to access. Say, given our current workspace, we're working in a code base, then the files URI can specify the current folder is actually operating under, such that the server should not be accessing any files beyond this. Or if we're operating with a database, we can say that this is a table that we're operating in, therefore do not touch anything else. So this is a useful way to define the current boundary of your work, such that you don't have MCP servers accidentally messing up other resources, and you constrain your work to a specific location. Now that you've seen the capabilities, I'll show you what the real protocol actually looks like. It looks more like this on the left, right? At the beginning, during the initialization phase, the client tries to understand what the capabilities the server provides, as well as allowing the servers to understand what other capabilities the client actually provides. And it's able to establish a channel for a bidirectional communication. And this is very important. The communication between the MCP client and server is bidirectional. And then during the operation phase, based on the capabilities it's discovered, and it's worth noting that not all servers or MCPs have to implement all of the capabilities listed here. They just need to let each other know what they are capable of. And then during the operation phase, then for each one of the model capabilities, it's able to list, is able to get the resources, is able to get the content, and say like for prompts, it can get the list of prompts and it can execute. And then like for the tools, obviously it can get the list of tools and execute on the tools, right? For the sampling capability, it has a human in the loop design, and that's up to the client to actually implement. And then there's a final shutdown phase. So really, the protocol is actually extremely versatile in terms of what it really enables. But as I mentioned before, with most servers, we are mostly just seeing the implementation of the tools part. But we know that MCP is about so much more. So let's actually look at a few MCP server implementations to explain how this whole thing works. If you were not sure where to find resources about MCP servers, make sure to just look at the MCP repositories. There's servers list. First of all, it has already built a whole bunch of reference servers with basic implementations that you can directly use, as well as listing a whole bunch of third-party servers the community has actually contributed, both official and unofficial ones. I know there's also plenty of registries that's currently out there to do discovery. I won't be going through them in this video. And I have to say, I'm working on a product myself to make MCP invocation a lot easier as well. If you're interested, ping me a message below. I'm happy to share some early details. Let's dive straight into the Slack MCP server. And you can see that it exposes mostly tools for, like sending messages, getting channels, getting users. Nothing fancy in the setup. You're already familiar with all of the configuration. Let's actually look at the implementation itself, right? So with all of the tools, it defines what the tool is, a description, a proper input schema of what the MCP client should be calling the server with, and with the basic requirements. And if we look at the actual implementation itself, let's say get channels, there's nothing fancy here, right? All it does actually directly call out to the Slack APIs here. And at this point, I think it is fair for most people to say, wait, this is just a wrapper around a REST API. There's nothing fancy here. And you would be absolutely correct. Which is why I said, if you're just implementing tools, yes, it is just the REST API wrappers. But that's beside the point, because this is only one small part of the model capability. Let's scroll a bit down further to actually see the response here, right? And all it returns back to the MCP client is your good old familiar completion text that has a content of type text, and it allows you to, put any random text there. There's no structure here because we leave it up to the LLM client on the MCP client side to then interpret this data. And you're not only able to just send text types, you can also send images, you can also send audio, and a bunch of other types. So that's one of the boring MCP servers. Let's find a slightly more interesting one, but only by a margin. We're going to look at the SQLite one. And the reason I want to dive into this one is not because it's actually much longer, but it implements one additional capability, the prompts part. Because inside the prompts part, this SQLite MCP server provided a prompt template to allow the client to populate the SQLite database for demo purposes. Obviously, this is not something that you have to use day to day, but interesting illustration here. If we look at the MCP server definition here, you can see that we've got a handle list resources. It's also got a example resource here. And again, just for demoing purposes, not to list any actual SQLite resources here. But if we look at the list prompts, it's able to say list the MCP demo prompt, and it's one telling that it can use this to demonstrate the integration of this MCP server, and it has a required argument to generate based on the topic. And so here you have to actually handle the get prompt when the request comes in with the relevant argument. How do you generate and populate that prompt to send back to the client? And then you have your standard list tools that we also saw in the Slack tools, right? I know some of you at this point will be asking, wait, I've never seen this thing. I've seen the tools, but I've never seen the prompt actually showing up. I have to say, mostly because this is actually quite badly implemented in most clients. And even in Claude, I had to look real hard to really find it in the UI. So it exists inside this, like this connector button on the Claude desktop app. Obviously here you have all of your MCP tools directly listed. There's attached from MCP. You have to choose from integrations, and then under your configured MCP server, you'll see this button that looks like the chat icon. So these are the prompt templates that you can attach, and the one that has a file icon, that's just the resources that you can attach. And if we click on this demo, you will be asked to populate the actual topic. Let's just say GDP for EU from like 2022 to 2024 across all countries. And if we add this prompt, you can see based on the logic, it's populated that prompt with the things that we've just mentioned. Because if we search for like GDP, you can see the user has chosen the topic and the rest comes from the prompt template. And let's go ahead. We won't provide any additional context because the prompt template is actually already given us all of that, right? And it knows to use that to do the full generation. Oh, I may have spoke too early, so I need to ask it explicitly. Populate the DB with this data. Here, well, the rest of the workflow you're already quite familiar with, right? I wish Claude just give me a way to turn on a YOLO mode to allow all MCP tools to just constantly run. Having to constantly deal with these pop-up is actually quite annoying. So we won't wait for these things to complete, but you can see the amount of data that's actually being written and also the data being generated without me having to write long prompts. So here's the important part. It's not enough for the servers to just provide the prompt templates. The client actually needs to surface this to the user, because the server can provide all of this template all they want. But if the client doesn't provide a way to surface this or provide a good way to surface this, then the user is never really going to find out where this is coming from. I'm sure you might be asking, wait, this template looks kind of useful. Why do I have this in Cursor and Windsurf? Well, that's because they only implemented the tools part of that specification, so they haven't added support for the prompts just yet. Here's another place I like to look for information, is inside the protocol spec itself and looking at the actual example clients. This provides a quite good updated list of what data is actually currently supported and what are the different capabilities that each client actually supports. If we dive into this one, actually let's make it slightly larger. In this list, we can see that Claude Desktop is decent and implementing most of the basic functionalities, as we've also just tested. If we look at, say, like Cursor, it's only implemented the tools feature, and similarly for Windsurf, I'd say almost across the board, you'll see that no one has actually implemented sampling. But in my personal view, sampling is by far the most interesting feature that clients could implement, because it finally allows the server to leverage the LLM capability to do more stuff, but without having to implement it themselves. But because of the human in the loop design that the protocol actually dictates, I think this is actually not an easy UX problem to solve. But we're starting to see some new UIs coming up that implement sampling. So hopefully in the coming month, we'll see more of that feature actually used both on the server side and also on the client side, because it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. If the server doesn't implement the sampling, anything that uses sampling, then the client has no incentive to implement this to allow the servers to achieve those new functionalities, right? So right now, we're mostly just stuck with tooling right now. But I'd say for this page, refresh it every now and then. It's very useful for discovering new client that actually comes up to find interesting things to play with. So today, the thing I just discovered is a thing called OTerm. It's a terminal-based chat that uses Ollama to do the chat. One of the few standard consumer-facing tools that implements sampling, right? So definitely give that a try. For the techies out there, I would really recommend a read through the full specification of the model context protocol here, because there is just so much capabilities that's currently defined, and understanding this really gives you a good idea of the interesting new capability that you could be implementing that no one is actually touching on yet. Because as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, most people are just focusing on tools, but there's so many more agentic behaviors that you can start to put in place with all of this. I know some people might start to say, wait, didn't Google just release a agent to agent protocol that solves that? It is definitely a very interesting protocol that would, I think, in a lot of aspects, compete with MCP. But exactly how it will turn out will really depend on community adoption. So we'll have to wait and see. But to me, MCP is already way powerful enough to enable most of that agentic behavior. The A2A SDK is a great another layer of abstraction on top, but it doesn't provide that much additional value in my personal view. There are nothing that cannot already be achieved directly in the MCP spec or already being planned in the roadmaps. That said, do also go and check out the roadmap section to see what is actually going on. And you'll see a lot of discussions that's actually being referenced across the community. One thing I'm most excited for, the registry. Apparently, from one of the latest talks a staff engineer at Anthropic gave, this is one of their top priority things to implement a public registry to allow easier discovery and also installation instruction setting through a centralized registry. When this is actually built, I think it will make our life so much easier so that we have to manage a little bit less of that configs and have a centralized way to find trusted and usable servers out there. Now that you have a great understanding of what MCP really is, how about you go and develop a MCP just for yourself to test out your full understanding? You should check out my AI coding videos just up there. And until then, happy shipping, and I'll see you in the next one.